Welcome, dear listeners, to another intriguing journey into the world of Hercule Poirot, Agatha Christie's legendary Belgian detective. In this story, inspired by the timeless charm and cerebral elegance of the original tales, we find Poirot and his loyal friend Hastings drawn into the sophisticated world of fine art, deception, and deadly ambition. Set in a private Mayfair gallery, Murder in the Marble Room invites you into a mystery filled with hidden motives, stolen identities, and the unmistakable wit and brilliance of Poirot himself. So sit back, let your imagination roam, and join us as Poirot engages his little grey cells to uncover the truth behind Murder in the Marble Room. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Intrigue. It was one of those cold London mornings where the fog clung to the streets like a sulky house guest who had overstayed their welcome. I was comfortably settled in my armchair, engrossed in the sporting section of the Times, when Poirot entered the sitting room with the precise steps of a man about to deliver important news. "Hastings," he said, holding a cream-coloured envelope between two fastidious fingers, "we are invited." "Are we?" I asked absently without looking up. "Another of your tedious lectures on crime detection, I suppose?" Poirot sniffed, wounded. "No, mon ami, nothing so commonplace. This," he held up the envelope with a flourish, "is an invitation to art." At that, I lowered my paper with mild suspicion. "Art?" "Just so. An exclusive unveiling at the Venn Gallery in Mayfair." He tapped the card. A Renaissance sculpture, thought lost for centuries, to be revealed to a select gathering. Très élégant. Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Your cultural limitations pain me, Hastings, but I forgive you. Besides, this is no ordinary sculpture. The piece in question is said to be a rediscovered work by the Florentine master Belladonna, famous for his lifelike marble figures. I attempted to feign interest, but failed miserably. "Florentine or not, I imagine it'll look like every other lump of stone I've seen in galleries, a headless nymph or some such." Poirot ignored my philistinism and continued, smoothing the invitation with care. "The host is one Gregory Venn, proprietor of the gallery, a man of some repute in artistic circles, and I gather of some eccentricities. The man is known for his dramatics. It is said that he curates not only art, but also the people who are allowed to view it." Poirot smiled faintly. "A snob, in other words, but one with impeccable taste." I muttered something unkind about art dealers in general. Poirot straightened his tie. "Besides," he added, "such gatherings are ripe with intrigue. Art invites passion. Passion invites folly. And folly, mon ami, invites crime. Surely you don't expect murder at an art unveiling?" I asked, only half joking. Poirot's moustache twitched. "One never knows, Hastings. One never knows." And so that evening, we found ourselves making our way through the fog to Mayfair, where the Venn Gallery stood like a gleaming modernist jewel among older Georgian facades. Its frosted glass doors and black marble steps reflected the soft glow of gas lamps from the street. A liveried attendant held the door open as we entered. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and champagne. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead. A small, well-dressed crowd milled about, murmuring over abstract paintings and bronze casts displayed along the perimeter. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, surveying the room with interest. "Observe, Hastings," he whispered. "The rich, the ambitious, the jealous, all drawn here by beauty and vanity." I merely sighed, longing for simpler evenings and simpler people. As we handed over our coats, a short, wiry man with a clipped moustache approached us. "Monsieur Poirot? Gregory Venn sends his compliments. The unveiling will commence shortly." "Excellent," Poirot replied with a little bow. "Lead on." The attendant gestured toward the central hall where the sculpture, still hidden behind heavy velvet curtains, stood on its plinth, awaiting revelation. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the drawn curtain. "I wonder," he murmured, "if the art is the only thing being concealed tonight." Chapter 2. The Marble Room, Mystery. The grand hall of the Venn Gallery was a study in controlled opulence. Polished marble floors reflected the soft glow of antique wall sconces, while muted string music played from speakers, cleverly hidden among plaster mouldings. At the far end of the room, a tall velvet curtain stood draped before the covered sculpture, the object of the evening's anticipation. Guests moved about with studied indifference, clutching champagne flutes and murmuring opinions about past exhibitions. Their tailored coats and silk gowns swirled through the room like a restless sea of wealth and self-importance. Poirot, of course, was perfectly at ease. He stood with his hands lightly clasped behind his back, observing the guests with quiet satisfaction. "Look at them, Hastings," he said softly. "All here to witness not merely a work of art, but to be seen witnessing it." I glanced toward the curtain with mild disinterest. Let us hope the thing is at least recognizable as a human figure. Before Poirot could scold me for my lack of artistic refinement, there was a subtle shift in the crowd. The murmur of voices lowered as a slim figure ascended a small platform near the sculpture. Gregory Venn had arrived. The man cut an unmistakable silhouette. He was tall, lean, and impeccably dressed in a midnight blue suit that shimmered ever so slightly under the lights. His silver hair was swept back from a high forehead, and his sharp features gave him the air of a Renaissance noble. Yet there was something brittle about him, something strained beneath the practiced smile. Venn raised a hand, and the room obediently fell silent. "Distinguished guests," he began, his voice smooth but lacking warmth. "Tonight you stand on the threshold of history. After decades of speculation and countless scholarly debates, I am honored to unveil a rediscovered masterpiece." He paused for effect, his gaze sweeping across the crowd as if daring anyone to question his pronouncement. "The sculpture you are about to witness is believed to be the work of the Florentine master Belladonna, lost to the world for over 300 years. A ripple of polite gasps moved through the guests. Poirot arched an eyebrow. Venn allowed himself a small smile. A singular moment for art, for the gallery, and indeed for all of us fortunate enough to bear witness. He made a small gesture to a gallery assistant who stood by the curtain rope. With practiced ceremony, the assistant pulled. The velvet parted to reveal the sculpture. For a moment, I had to admit, it was impressive. The figure of a woman stood carved from pale marble, her expression serene, her outstretched hand reaching as though to grasp something just beyond her. The drapery of her gown flowed in intricate folds, the artistry so fine it seemed the fabric might flutter if caught by a breeze. But before I could comment, there was a sudden disturbance. Venn, who had taken a theatrical step toward the sculpture, as if to bask in its glory, faltered. His hand rose to his chest. His eyes widened, staring at some unseen point on the far wall. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, he collapsed, striking the marble floor with a sickening finality. Gasps erupted, several guests screamed, champagne glasses shattered as people stepped back in alarm. Poirot was already moving, weaving through the stunned onlookers with surprising speed. I followed, heart pounding. By the time we reached him, Gregory Venn lay still, his face pale and ashen. One of the gallery staff knelt beside him, checking his pulse with trembling fingers. "He is gone," the young man whispered. Poirot crouched briefly, observing the body with a keen and practiced eye. His gaze moved to the man's clenched hands, the set of his shoulders, and finally to the faint but unmistakable odor in the air. I caught it too, a bitter, almost almond-like tang that hovered just above the floor. Poirot stood and turned to the gallery manager, a thin man with spectacles named Hallam. "Lock the building immediately," Poirot said, his tone leaving no room for argument. No one leaves. Hallam nodded, pale but obedient. "Yes, Mr. Poirot, of course. Standard protocol for emergencies." As the doors were secured and the staff moved to calm the panicked guests, another detail quickly emerged. A small key, silver and distinctive, was known to hang from a chain in Gregory Venn's waistcoat pocket. The key that opened the marble room, a private chamber behind the main gallery where the most valuable pieces were kept. But now, as Hallam frantically searched the body, the key was missing. Poirot glanced toward the locked marble room door at the far side of the gallery. His expression was unreadable, but I knew that look well. The game, as they say, was afoot. Chapter 3. A Death Too Convenient. By the time Inspector Japp arrived at the Venn Gallery, the atmosphere had grown thick with speculation and hushed gossip. The guests, now gathered in the smaller lounge, spoke in lowered tones, casting furtive glances toward the locked marble room and the spot where Gregory Venn's body still lay under a hastily draped cloth. Japp entered with his usual brisk authority, his overcoat flaring behind him as though he had been pulled away from more pressing business, which, knowing Japp, was likely true. "Well, well," he said, pulling off his gloves with a snap. "Can't leave you alone for 5 minutes, can I, Poirot?" Poirot, standing near the foot of the grand staircase, gave a modest inclination of his head. "It is always a pleasure to see you, mon ami, even under such unfortunate circumstances." Japp approached the body, crouching beside the still form of Gregory Venn with the ease of long habit. After a brief examination, he straightened, dusting his hands against his coat. "Looks like a straightforward heart attack to me," he said. "Middle-aged, bit high-strung by the looks of him, and these society types do love their late nights and cigars. Probably keeled over from the excitement." Poirot said nothing at first. He stepped closer, his gaze narrowing on the scene with that meticulous attention to detail I had come to recognize. His eyes drifted toward the floor. "You observe the position of the body, Japp?" he asked mildly. Japp gave a small shrug. "What about it?" Poirot knelt, touching the edge of Venn's right shoe with a gloved finger. "A scuff mark here, as though he was dragged slightly after falling. The angle is wrong for a simple collapse." Japp frowned but said nothing. Poirot rose and turned toward a nearby side table. There, half hidden behind a floral arrangement, sat a single crystal glass. The rim caught the light as Poirot lifted it delicately between thumb and forefinger. "There is lipstick here," Poirot said softly, holding the glass out for our inspection. "But I am informed by Mr. Hallam that Monsieur Venn drank only whiskey, never wine or cocktails. And certainly never from a glass such as this." I leaned closer, noting the faint smudge of deep red along the rim. "A guest's glass, perhaps?" I offered. Poirot shook his head. "Non. This was placed here deliberately, and more importantly—" He sniffed the contents of the glass, then set it down carefully. "The scent of bitter almonds, unmistakable even in so small a quantity?" Japp's eyes narrowed. "Cyanide?" Poirot nodded gravely. "It would appear so." Japp let out a low whistle and scratched his chin. "Well, now that changes things." Poirot crossed to where Hallam stood, near the lounge entrance, pale and wringing his hands. "Mr. Hallam," Poirot said, "you mentioned that Mr. Venn always carried the key to the marble room." "Yes, sir," Hallam replied nervously. "On a chain in his waistcoat pocket. It was never out of his possession." And yet now, Poirot said, spreading his hands, it is gone. Hallam nodded miserably. Poirot turned back to Japp. You see, my friend, the missing key, the scuff marks, the poisoned drink, all these are not the signs of a natural death. On the contrary, they suggest calculation. Japp sighed heavily, already regretting the call he would soon have to make to Scotland Yard headquarters. So, we're dealing with murder. Poirot's eyes glinted. Mais oui, my dear Japp, murder most artful, and I fear most carefully planned. As the inspector moved to begin formal interviews with the guests, Poirot walked slowly back toward the now silent marble room door. He placed one hand lightly on the polished brass handle. I wonder, he murmured to himself, if the key to this mystery lies inside these walls, or within the hearts of those who stood so close, yet saw so little. I watched him thoughtfully, knowing that wherever the truth lay, Poirot would find it. It was only a matter of time. Chapter 4. Guests Under Glass. By the following morning, the Venn Gallery had taken on the air of a sealed exhibit in itself, its occupants trapped behind invisible glass like curiosities awaiting inspection. Inspector Japp had stationed 2 uniformed officers at the entrances, and no one was permitted to leave the premises until further notice. Poirot, for his part, had taken control of the interviews with characteristic composure, seated near the long window in the upstairs office that overlooked the main exhibition floor. The setting, with its angular furniture and cold modernist decor, seemed to amuse him. A room designed for intimidation, Poirot observed, as he adjusted the crease of his trousers. Fitting, n'est-ce pas, Hastings, for our purposes today? I settled into a nearby chair with my notebook, ready to assist. The first to be called was Claudine Venn, the deceased's younger sister. She entered with a measured step, her expression perfectly composed, though her dark eyes flickered with something close to resentment. She wore a tailored black dress that suggested mourning, though I suspected it had been selected more for fashion than grief. Her long gloves remained on her hands, even as she sat. "My brother and I," she began coolly, "were not what you would call close." Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed, mademoiselle. And yet you attended his event?" "A public gesture," she replied, glancing toward the window. "Nothing more. We had not spoken at length for months. Gregory had a talent for alienating people." Poirot pressed her on her whereabouts during the minutes leading up to the unveiling. She claimed to have been in the South Gallery admiring a landscape collection. Hallam, she said, could confirm this, though her tone suggested she would rather not be confirmed by anyone at all. Next came Alistair Drake, an art dealer whose sharp features and restless hands betrayed a nervous energy. He wore a boutonniere in his lapel and a tie that looked just a shade too expensive. "Venn and I," Drake said, smoothing his hair, "had what you might call a professional rivalry. Competing galleries, competing clients, the usual London games, but I would hardly poison the man over it." Poirot asked him pointedly if he had ever entered the marble room. Drake laughed, though it did not sound sincere. Gregory never allowed anyone inside without personal invitation. It was his sanctum, his obsession. Poirot studied him for a moment, then nodded for the next guest to be brought in. Celeste Renard, the gallery's art restorer, entered with quiet dignity. She was a woman of perhaps 40, with olive skin and dark hair pulled into a chignon. Her hands, pale and slender, bore faint stains from paint and varnish. "I was in the restoration studio when it happened," she said softly, her French accent lilting. "I heard the commotion and came running." Poirot tilted his head. "And your relationship with Monsieur Venn?" Celeste's lips tightened. "Professional. Distant?" But not always so, perhaps? Poirot asked gently. Her gaze dropped to her hands. We all have pasts, Monsieur Poirot. Before Poirot could press her further, she rose, signalling the end of her willingness to speak. Hastings, ever observant, scribbled a note. Celeste evasive, personal history with Venn. The next to appear was Victor Hallam, the gallery's curator. Thin and pale, Hallam looked like a man who had not slept in days. His wire-rimmed spectacles perched awkwardly on his nose, and his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. I was coordinating the guest list and supervising the security staff, he said quickly. I had no reason to harm Mr. Venn. This gallery is my livelihood. Poirot's eyes narrowed. You knew about the missing key? Hallam swallowed hard. Yes, of course. I checked his waistcoat pocket myself. It was gone. And the marble room, Poirot said. Who else besides you and Mr. Venn had access? No one, Hallam replied, voice tight. He was adamant about that. Finally, Leonie Stroud, the fashionable art critic, was ushered in. Tall and willowy, Leonie wore a dramatic hat and a scent that lingered heavily in the air after she passed. She answered Poirot's questions with amused detachment. Gregory Venn enjoyed controversy, she said, crossing her legs with languid grace. He liked to create spectacle, even at his own expense. Poirot inquired about her movements during the fatal moment. I was near the sculpture display, she replied, along with half the guest list, though I must confess I was more interested in observing the reactions of others than the art itself. As she rose to leave, she turned back with a knowing smile. I imagine, Monsieur Poirot, that you already suspect half the people in this building. Poirot smiled modestly in return. Mademoiselle, I suspect everyone until I no longer need to. Once she was gone, Poirot folded his hands together, leaning back in his chair. Well, Hastings, he said thoughtfully, we have vanity, we have rivalry, we have secrets, all the ingredients of human folly laid out like colours on a painter's palette. Which one is the killer? I asked. Poirot smiled, his eyes gleaming. Ah, he said, the canvas is not yet complete, but soon, mon ami, very soon. Chapter 5. The Vanishing Key. The matter of the missing key soon became the focal point of Poirot's attention. While Inspector Japp busied himself with statements from the guests and the coroner's preliminary findings, Poirot could be found wandering the length of the gallery's main corridor, pausing now and then to peer thoughtfully at the locked door of the marble room. Curious, Hastings, he murmured, pausing to adjust the set of his tie. Most curious. I followed close behind, notebook in hand. You mean the key? Poirot nodded. Just so, the key that, according to all who knew Mr. Venn, was kept upon his person at all times, never left unattended, never entrusted to another. We had already verified this with Hallam and 2 of the senior attendants. Venn had made a small ceremony, it seemed, of patting the pocket of his waistcoat at regular intervals, as though to reassure himself of the key's presence. Yet now, Poirot continued, the key is absent. And with the room still locked from within, I said, glancing toward the heavy oak door at the far end of the corridor. Its brass handle gleamed under the gallery lights, silent and immovable. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, but we cannot assume it is locked from within, my friend. Only that it is locked. That is an important distinction. At that moment, Hallam approached, looking even paler than the day before. I have double-checked every key in the building, he said, holding out a small collection on a brass ring. None of them fits the marble room. There was only ever one key. Poirot accepted the ring with a polite nod and examined each key carefully, though I could tell his mind was already several steps ahead. We must ask ourselves, he said at last. "Who had the opportunity to take it from Mr. Venn's pocket after his collapse?" "Or before," I suggested. Poirot's eyes glinted. "Just so, Hastings. Very good. It was as we moved toward the south corridor that I happened upon something peculiar. Near one of the fire exits, where a seldom-used service door led to the rear of the building, I noticed a faint but distinct footprint on the polished marble floor. "Poirot," I called, crouching beside it. "Look here." He approached and knelt gracefully beside me. The footprint was small, with a narrow sole and a slight heel. The polish of the marble had preserved the outline remarkably well. "Most interesting," Poirot said, tracing the edge with a gloved finger. "The dust, you see. This part of the gallery is seldom used, and the cleaners clearly overlooked this spot. Our visitor left their signature without intending to." We followed the trail, which led toward the service door. Hallam, called once more to assist, confirmed that the door had been locked earlier, but admitted that staff occasionally used it during late-night installations or deliveries. "The lock is old," Hallam added nervously. "Anyone familiar with the building might know how to force it open without leaving visible damage." Poirot examined the door, then stood back with a satisfied air. "I believe," he said, "that whoever took the key intended to use this route to avoid detection. Whether they succeeded or not is another matter." Japp appeared from the far end of the corridor, looking harassed and holding a sheaf of witness statements. "Find something, have you?" he asked, glancing toward the footprint. "Only the beginning of something," Poirot replied, smiling. "You see, my friend, it is never just the object that matters, but the manner of its disappearance. A key vanishes, a door remains locked, and now we have a footprint to consider. Each small puzzle piece, when examined with care, leads us closer to the whole picture." I scribbled furiously in my notebook as Poirot turned back toward the marble room door. "The key, Hastings," he said softly. "Somewhere within this building lies the key. To the door, yes, but more importantly, to the entire mystery." Chapter 6. Portraits and Pretenders. By mid-afternoon, Poirot's attention had shifted to a narrow, leather-bound book kept on a pedestal near the marble room entrance. The visitor log, as Hallam explained, was a gallery tradition. Anyone granted access to the marble room was required to sign their name and record the time of entry and departure. Poirot flipped through the pages with delicate care, one fingertip running lightly along each line. I stood nearby, trying to make sense of the looping signatures and erratic handwriting. "Observe, Hastings," Poirot murmured, pointing to a cluster of entries from the week leading up to the unveiling. "Several names appear here that raise questions." I leaned in. "Drake, Celeste Renard, Hallam? Seems straightforward enough." "Perhaps too straightforward," Poirot said softly. "Notice, for example, that Monsieur Drake's entry claims he left the marble room at 3:30 last Tuesday afternoon." I nodded. "Yes, and—" Poirot closed the book and turned toward the main gallery. "Yet Monsieur Drake told us yesterday that he has not set foot in the marble room for months." I frowned. "That is odd." "And Miss Renard," Poirot continued, "claims her last visit was 2 weeks ago to examine the base of the sculpture for restoration cleaning, yet the log shows her signing in just 3 days before the unveiling." We called Hallam, who arrived looking more flustered than ever. "Could the log have been tampered with?" Poirot asked him. Hallam adjusted his spectacles nervously. I do not see how. The book is kept here under staff supervision." Poirot pressed him on whether anyone might have slipped in unnoticed to make false entries. Hallam hesitated, then admitted that during busy exhibit changeovers, the gallery floor could be chaotic. "There are gaps in supervision," he confessed, "but only briefly. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Briefly is often enough, Mr. Hallam." Leaving the log for the moment, Poirot turned his attention back to the sculpture itself. It stood, serene and luminous under the gallery lights, surrounded now by a low velvet barrier erected at Japp's request. Poirot examined the folds of marble with great scrutiny, tilting his head and occasionally stepping back for a wider view. "I wonder," he said softly, "if what we see is truly what we have." I watched, puzzled, as he ran a gloved hand near the base, stopping at an almost invisible seam where the pedestal met the sculpture. Without a word, Poirot summoned Celeste Renard from the restoration studio. She arrived a few minutes later, her expression guarded. "Miss Renard," Poirot began smoothly, "may I ask again about your involvement with this piece?" Celeste folded her arms, keeping her gaze steady. "As I told you yesterday, I was asked to perform minor surface cleaning and structural inspection before the unveiling. Nothing more." "And yet," Poirot said, gesturing toward the sculpture, "there are certain inconsistencies in the stone texture near the lower folds, newer chisel marks perhaps, or a difference in varnish." Her eyes narrowed. "I assure you, Monsieur Poirot, I have performed no unauthorized work on that statue." "But you suspect something," Poirot said, smiling gently. "Do you not?" For a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. But she recovered quickly. "I suspect nothing," she said. "If there is deception here, it was not of my making." Poirot gave a small bow. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful." As she departed, Poirot turned to me with a glint in his eye. "There is forgery here, Hastings," he said softly. "Not only of signatures in a visitor log, but perhaps of marble itself." I stared at him, baffled. "You mean the sculpture?" Poirot smiled, smoothing his moustache with satisfaction. "Exactement. But the time is not yet right to reveal my suspicions. First, we must know who has been pretending and why." Chapter 7. Poison and Performance. The coroner's preliminary report arrived late that afternoon, delivered by a uniformed constable whose solemn expression left little doubt as to the contents. Japp read through the document with a scowl, muttering under his breath as he flipped the pages. "Well, that settles it," he said at last, looking up at Poirot and me. "Cyanide. No question about it." Poirot, who had been pacing the length of the gallery floor with his hands clasped behind his back, paused mid-step. "Ingested, I presume?" Japp nodded. "Traces found in the stomach. Concentration suggests he swallowed it just moments before he collapsed." I felt a shiver run down my spine. The matter was no longer one of theory or speculation. Gregory Venn had been poisoned. Poirot moved toward the small service table near the far wall, where Japp had collected items found near the scene. Among them sat the now infamous wine glass, its rim still marked with a faint trace of lipstick. "The glass," Poirot said softly, lifting it with delicate care, "was found behind the Greco-Roman display, was it not?" Japp confirmed with a nod. "Tucked behind one of the plinths. Looks like it was placed there in a hurry." "And yet," Poirot mused, "Venn was known never to drink wine at these events. Only whiskey. A well-established habit, confirmed by both staff and guests." He stepped back, turning to face us both. "Someone prepared this glass, laced with poison, and ensured it reached his hand at the precise moment of the unveiling." "It could have been passed to him easily enough," I suggested. Among the crowd, with all eyes on the curtain. As we stood discussing the implications, Claudine Venn entered the room. She had changed into more sombre attire, though the dark veil she wore over her face seemed more a fashion statement than a sign of mourning. Poirot approached her gently. Mademoiselle Venn, I regret that I must trouble you again. She stiffened. What is it now, Monsieur Poirot? Must we endure yet another round of questions? Poirot's voice remained calm. I am afraid so, mademoiselle. I must ask, did you and your brother quarrel in recent weeks? Claudine hesitated. Her gloved hands twitched at her sides. Then, quite suddenly, the veneer of composure cracked. Yes, she said, her voice low and tight. We quarrelled bitterly. She sank into a nearby chair, her shoulders trembling. He cut me off from everything. Poirot crouched beside her chair, speaking softly. Disinherited you? Yes, she whispered. Only a fortnight ago. He revised his will, leaving everything to the gallery trust. Not a penny for me. Her breath caught. He said I was irresponsible, unworthy of the Venn legacy, that the gallery mattered more than family. Poirot exchanged a glance with Japp, who had stepped closer, his notebook already in hand. And did you threaten him? Japp asked, though not unkindly. Claudine lifted her head, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I said many things. I was angry, but I never wanted this. Poirot studied her for a long moment, then stood. Emotions, when wounded, can fester, he said gently, but they do not on their own produce poison. As Claudine buried her face in her hands, Poirot turned away, his gaze drifting once more toward the locked marble room. Come, Hastings, he said softly. There are still too many missing pieces, and I do not like unfinished puzzles. Together we followed him, leaving Claudine to her grief or her performance, depending on which it proved to be. Chapter 8. Shadows in Marble. The gallery had grown quiet by early evening, with most guests now dismissed and only essential staff remaining under Japp's orders. Poirot stood near the base of the grand staircase, gazing thoughtfully at the marble room's locked door, his head tilted in that familiar way that signalled deep calculation. "Tell me, Hastings," he said, breaking the silence, "have you noticed what is most peculiar about yesterday's sequence of events?" I frowned, flipping through my notebook. Well, there is the missing key, the poisoned wine, the contradictory visitor log entries. Poirot smiled faintly. All true, mon ami, but let us consider the question of time. Before I could respond, Japp appeared, holding a folder thick with paper. I pulled the gallery's security logs like you asked, Japp said, handing them over. Hallam keeps meticulous records. Camera coverage is limited, mostly entry and exit points, but there is a digital sign-in sheet for staff movements on the internal network. Poirot accepted the folder with a nod and settled into a chair near the east window. I watched as he pored over the pages, his eyes narrowing with each line he read. Voilà, he said at last, tapping a particular entry. Here is something interesting. Japp and I leaned in to look. The logs detailed staff keycard entries, noting times when secured doors had been accessed. According to the records, there was a 10-minute period between 20 minutes to 5 and 10 minutes to 5 when none of the monitored doors recorded any movement. 10 minutes of silence, Poirot said, closing the folder with care. And it is during this window, I believe, that our murderer acted. Japp scratched his head. You mean someone slipped away from the main gallery? Exactly, Poirot said. We must remember that the unveiling was scheduled precisely at 5 o'clock. During that 10-minute gap, our killer had just enough time to prepare. I thought back to the busy scene before the unveiling. Guests had milled about, champagne flutes in hand, chatting under the soft glow of the gallery lights. Staff had been distracted with final preparations. Could they have used the service door we found near the footprint? I asked. Poirot nodded. It is a possibility, but more likely I think they used the marble room itself. Japp's eyes widened. You think the killer hid inside? Poirot rose, smoothing his jacket with deliberate care. Consider, my friends, the advantages. The marble room was locked, its entrance secured by Venn himself. No one would expect the killer to be inside, and yet, with the key missing and the door unopened since before the unveiling, it provides the perfect refuge. Japp frowned. But that would mean they had the key before Venn collapsed. Precisely, Poirot said. And it would explain the curious absence during the critical 10 minutes. I glanced back at the door, a new sense of unease settling over me. If that is true, I said, then the killer was watching, listening, perhaps only feet away while Venn was poisoned. Poirot nodded gravely. It is an unsettling thought, Hastings, but it aligns with the facts. I suspect that whoever took the key used the marble room to stage part of their alibi. They emerged only at the last possible moment, just in time to blend with the shocked crowd. Japp closed his notebook with a sigh. I'll have my men search every corner of that room the moment we get it open. Poirot smiled gently. Be sure to check not only for physical clues, but for spaces large enough to conceal a person, even if only briefly. Japp gave a short laugh. Hiding among the marble statues. What next? Poirot's gaze lingered on the door. Murder, he said softly, is often hidden in plain sight. We left Japp to organize the search while Poirot moved to the central staircase. I could see the wheels turning in his mind. The time for answers, I knew, was drawing close. Chapter 9. The Forger's Brushstroke. The following morning, Poirot requested that Celeste Renard be brought to the upstairs office for a private conversation. I stood at my usual post by the window, pretending to jot down notes while listening intently. The air in the gallery had taken on a heavy stillness, as though the building itself waited for Poirot's next revelation. Celeste entered with her usual poise, though there was a tightness around her mouth that had not been there before. She settled into the chair opposite Poirot, crossing her legs carefully, her hands folded in her lap. Poirot began with remarkable gentleness. Mademoiselle Renard, you understand that I ask these questions not from idle curiosity, but in the service of justice. She offered him a thin smile. I suspected as much, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot opened a slim folder that Hallam had delivered earlier that morning. Inside were several typewritten reports, most of them stamped with the official insignia of the French police. Your name, Poirot said softly, appears in connection with certain artistic matters from your years in Paris and Lyon. Matters involving forgery? Her face remained expressionless, but I noticed her fingers tightening on the armrest. You were known by another name then, Poirot continued. Isabelle Laurent, a talented artisan sought after for your skill with marble aging techniques. Celeste let out a slow breath. That was a lifetime ago, she said. Perhaps, Poirot said, folding the file shut. But the past has a habit of following us, does it not? She hesitated for a long moment before speaking again. Yes, she said at last, her voice low. Gregory Venn knew everything. He discovered my history years ago. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. And he used that knowledge to blackmail you. She gave a small, bitter laugh. Blackmail? Such a crude word, but yes, that is the truth of it. He threatened to expose me unless I agreed to certain requests. Such as? Poirot prompted. Celeste looked away toward the window. Restoring pieces that did not require restoration. Creating subtle modifications to provenance documents. On more than one occasion. Fabricating rediscovered artworks to sell to private collectors at inflated prices. I felt a chill. The revelation cast the entire gallery in a new and sinister light. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And this most recent piece, the so-called Renaissance sculpture unveiled at the event? Celeste hesitated before answering. A clever fabrication, she said at last. I worked on it under duress. The marble is authentic, yes, but the sculpting, much of it was done recently in the style of the original period. Venn planned to sell it to an overseas buyer after the exhibition, claiming it as a genuine rediscovery. Japp, who had entered during her confession and stood by the door, let out a low whistle. So the whole thing was a con. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. A deception layered upon deception. Celeste's eyes glistened, but she did not cry. I hated him for it, she said. But I did not kill him, I swear it. Poirot studied her carefully. Hate is a powerful motive, mademoiselle, but so is fear. Yet I believe you. For now. As she left the room, Poirot remained seated, gazing at the closed door long after she was gone. I turned to him. You really think she is innocent? Poirot's fingers tapped lightly against the folder on the desk. She has told us the truth about her past, which was perhaps the hardest thing for her to do. But whether she has told us the whole truth, that remains to be seen. He stood and moved toward the staircase once more, the gleam returning to his eyes. Come, Hastings, he said quietly. We are nearly there. Only a few more threads to untangle before the final picture reveals itself. Chapter 10. The Final Exhibit. The marble room, at last unlocked under Poirot's supervision, stood before us in all its cold splendour. The air was thick with the scent of stone and polish, and the pale light from the high windows gave the room a ghostly quality. The statues, silent and stoic, lined the walls like witnesses waiting for the truth. Poirot had summoned everyone to gather inside. Inspector Japp stood near the doorway, arms crossed and eyes narrowed, ready for the final reveal. Claudine Venn sat stiffly on a velvet stool, her face pale but composed. Alistair Drake lingered near the corner, pretending nonchalance but shifting from foot to foot. Celeste Renard stood near the far wall, arms folded tightly, while Victor Hallam hovered nervously near the entrance. Poirot cleared his throat, and all eyes turned to him. My friends, he began, his voice calm but commanding, we have reached the conclusion of our little mystery. You are all gathered here because this room holds not only marble and art, but also the truth. He moved toward the central sculpture, the so-called Renaissance masterpiece that had caused so much trouble. Let us begin with the missing key, Poirot said, placing a small metal object onto a velvet cloth on the display table. Gasps rose around the room. The key was concealed here, he continued, tapping gently against the lower section of the sculpture's pedestal. Inside a hollow space, cleverly carved to fit it, a hiding place only accessible to someone familiar with the piece's construction. Japp stepped forward, examining the small cavity now visible where a panel had been removed. Which explains how the killer was able to lock the marble room from the outside after using it to hide, Poirot said, looking at each guest in turn. Drake opened his mouth to speak, but Poirot raised a hand. Before you ask, he said, I must also explain the method of poisoning. He gestured for Hallam to bring the wine glass, carefully stored in a sealed evidence bag. Poirot held it aloft for all to see. During the final moments before the unveiling, when all eyes were on the curtain and the dramatic presentation about to unfold, the killer slipped this glass to Mr. Venn. Poirot's gaze rested firmly on Claudine. His customary whiskey glass had been temporarily removed, replaced with this, containing just enough poisoned wine to ensure his collapse at the critical moment. Claudine's breath caught in her throat. That is a lie. Poirot stepped closer. Is it? The lipstick on the rim matches the shade you wore that evening. You were seen near the refreshments table, and more importantly, your fingerprints were found on the stem. Her composure cracked. I only meant to frighten him, she whispered, shaking her head. I wanted him to panic, to make a scene, not to die. Poirot's voice softened. Yet the cyanide was already there. Perhaps a tragic miscalculation, but one with deadly consequences. Japp stepped forward, giving Claudine a long, measured look. We'll discuss your intentions at the station, he said grimly. Poirot held up a hand. One moment, Chief Inspector. Before you go, there is one final truth that must be laid bare. He turned to Celeste Renard. Mademoiselle Renard, while you may not have poisoned Mr. Venn, your forgeries allowed this entire drama to unfold. Your unwilling partnership with Mr. Venn created the perfect environment for deception. Celeste lowered her head, but said nothing. Poirot allowed a moment of silence to settle over the room. The crime was not only of art, he said at last, but of trust, of legacy, and of human weakness. With that, he gathered his hat and gloves and gave a small bow to the assembled guests. Come, Hastings, he said softly. Our work here is done. As we left the marble room behind, I could not help but glance back at the cold stone figures standing motionless in their alcoves. For the first time they seemed to me less like art and more like silent judges staring down at the folly of men. Chapter 11. Unmasking the Killer. The air in the marble room remained heavy long after Claudine was escorted out by Japp's men. Poirot lingered by the sculpture, his gaze fixed on the faint outline where the hidden compartment had been discovered. Curious, he said softly, almost to himself. I stepped closer. What is it now, Poirot? I thought it was settled. Claudine poisoned her brother. Her fingerprints were on the glass. Poirot shook his head gently. Non, mon ami. Claudine intended to frighten her brother, yes, but she did not poison him. Someone else saw an opportunity within her reckless scheme. Before I could ask further, Poirot turned toward the remaining guests. Alistair Drake shifted uncomfortably near the doorway. Celeste Renard kept her gaze lowered, her hands clenched at her sides, but it was Victor Hallam, the quiet curator, who drew Poirot's full attention. Mr. Hallam, Poirot said, his voice light but firm, I must trouble you for one more explanation. Hallam blinked, visibly startled. Me? I do not see why. Poirot took a slow step forward. You had access, monsieur, to the gallery's layout, to the marble room, and to the internal security systems. You were in the perfect position to manipulate both time and space that day. Hallam swallowed hard. That is absurd. I have worked here for years. Exactly, Poirot replied, his gaze narrowing. Which is why no one questioned your movements. You arranged the marble room's internal locks weeks ago. You engineered the visitor log discrepancies. And when Claudine tampered with her brother's drink as part of her own foolish plan, you seized your chance. Hallam's face went pale. I do not know what you mean. Poirot's voice remained steady. You had been blackmailed by Venn for years, had you not? You knew about the forgeries, the black market deals, the fraudulent sales masked as gallery acquisitions. And when Venn prepared to sell the forged sculpture to an overseas buyer without giving you your promised share, you acted. The room went still. On the day of the unveiling, Poirot continued, you entered the marble room during that 10-minute window before 5 o'clock. With the key already in your possession, you unlocked the door, slipped inside, and waited. Once the commotion began outside, you emerged unseen, blending into the crowd. You placed the poisoned wine where Venn would reach for it, knowing Claudine's little prank would provide the perfect distraction. Japp crossed his arms, eyeing Hallam carefully. We found traces of cyanide powder in the small storeroom near the service corridor, a room only you had keys for. Hallam's composure cracked at last. "He ruined my life," he muttered, almost inaudibly. "Years of work, loyalty, and for what? To be threatened? To be used?" Poirot's expression softened, but only slightly. "And so you committed murder." Hallam let out a slow, shaking breath, then straightened his shoulders as if preparing himself for the inevitable. Japp signalled for his officers. As they led Hallam away, Poirot turned back to me, his expression unreadable. "It is often the quiet ones, Hastings," he said softly. "Those who endure in silence until one day they cannot endure any longer." We stood for a moment longer in the marble room, the cold marble figures surrounding us like frozen witnesses to both beauty and crime. Chapter 12. The Vanity of Justice. The following morning, with Victor Hallam safely in police custody, the gallery began to return to something resembling normalcy. The staff moved quietly through the halls, speaking in hushed tones, as though afraid to disturb the lingering shadows of the crime. Poirot and I stood in the main hall near the mirrored display case, waiting for Japp to finish filing his final reports. Poirot examined his reflection with meticulous care, smoothing each end of his moustache with delicate precision. I could not help but chuckle. "You know, Poirot, after all this, I have come to one simple conclusion." "And what is that, mon ami?" he asked, still adjusting the angle of his tie. "I much prefer landscapes to sculptures," I said with a sigh. "At least trees do not hide poison and keys inside their trunks." Poirot smiled, tilting his head in quiet amusement. "Ah, but nature has its own deceptions, Hastings. Though I agree the vanity of men can be far more dangerous than that of stone." I turned toward the marble room, where workers were already covering the now infamous sculpture with protective cloth. I still cannot fathom it. Hallam seemed so harmless. Poirot's expression grew thoughtful. "Harmless on the surface, yes, but vanity is not always loud or boastful. Sometimes it festers quietly, taking root in those who feel overlooked and undervalued." He gestured toward the covered sculpture. Ven's vanity lay in his greed, his manipulation of art, and his belief that he could control people like he controlled his collection. Hallam's vanity was of a different sort. It was the vanity of a man who believed he deserved recognition, who resented being used and cast aside. Poirot turned back to the mirror, giving one final satisfied tug to his moustache. "And now, justice is served. Art may deceive the eye, Hastings, but it cannot fool the little grey cells." Japp approached with his hat in hand. "That just about wraps it up," he said, glancing between us. "Another one for your scrapbook, eh, Poirot?" Poirot inclined his head graciously. "Not a scrapbook, Chief Inspector, a study in human nature." We left the gallery behind, the late morning sun casting long shadows on the Mayfair pavement. As we walked, I found myself wondering what new mystery lay ahead. Poirot, however, simply hummed to himself, content, as always, in the triumph of order over chaos. Thank you for joining us on this case of vanity, forgery, and hidden revenge. In Murder in the Marble Room, Poirot once again reminds us that while appearances may deceive and beauty may mislead, no detail escapes the attention of the little grey cells. If you enjoyed this story, please consider exploring more of our Hercule Poirot fan fiction mysteries. Each tale is crafted with care and admiration for Agatha Christie's iconic creations. Until our next case together, thank you for listening.